So we're on Daf Lamed Zayin Amid Beis, and we're up to Yosef Rabbah of Rav Yosef, which is approximately, I would say, 3/4 of the way down the Amud, or if you count up from the bottom of the Amud, it's 1, 2, 3, 4. I'd say 12 lines up from the bottom. Yosef Rabbah of Rav Yosef.
Got it.
So the Gemara tells us about two Amoraim, two of the greats, Rabbah and Rav Yosef, and they were sitting Achored Rabbi Zera. They were sitting behind Rab Zera, the Yosef Rab Zera Kame de Ula. And Rab Zera was sitting in front of Ula. Amalei Rabba Rab Zera, in other words, since you're sitting in front of Ula, boy minemi Ula, you have a better access to Ula, and ask him the following question: Hidbik mi bifnim v'hersiach mi bachutz. What's the law in a case where he took this dough and he smacked it up against the inside of like a frying pan, and he turned on the fire underneath the frying pan? Mahu, what's the din of this dough as far as the chiyuv challah is concerned? Now, this question should be seen in a broader context of Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish holds that if you fry something you take a dough and you pour it into a frying pan, that's not called a Maaser tanur. That's not called afia. It doesn't qualify as baking. It's called a Maaser ilfus. It's frying and not baking. But maybe in this case, he's doing it in a way that's very, very close to baking it, because he was already madbik mi b'fnim. So, like, there's the heat of the ilfus, and when he smacks up the dough against the walls of the ilfus, it's almost like taking a dough, and what they used to do, especially if they had the large ovens, once they heated up the oven, all they had to do was smack the dough against the wall of the oven. The wall of the oven was so hot that it baked almost immediately. So the Gemara wants to know, would this situation be chayiv and challah or not? I have here well, let's just see the next part of the Gemara. Amar Le, so Rab Zera said to Rabbah, and Rab Zera was sort of sent on a mission here by Rabbah to ask Ula this question, but before he did so, Rab Zera turns back to Rabbah and he says, "My Amole." In other words, you're asking me to ask him a ridiculous question. Maybe you better ask him, not me. I don't want to embarrass myself. And why is that? The Iaminale, if I'm going to ask him this question, Amar Li, he's going to answer me, "Hey, Niu Maaser Ilfus." That this is exactly a Maaser Ilfus. This is the case where Reish Lakish said you're potter from challah, because every ilfus is heated up on the fire before you put the dough into the ilfus. And that's exactly the case in which Reish Lakish paskin that it's not chayiv and challah, it's not afia. So I'm really asking a pretty dumb question. And now the Gemara concludes that this description that we had until now is the classic Maaser Ilfus. And Amar Le, so the Gemara says, Rav Yosef now gets his turn, and he says to Rab Zera, you're sitting up front there next to Ula, ask him this question. Boy minemi Ula, idvik bifnim mi bifnim v'avuka kenegdo. So what it means is that there is a torch, a very intense source of fire, which is now coming on top of the ilfus. Now, it's normally the source of heat is coming below the frying pan. And that's not similar to afia, because in afia, it surrounds the dough. But what happens if he takes a flame, a very strong fire, an intense fire, and he heats up the contents of the ilfus, meaning the dough that's inside the frying pan, since the heat is so intense, and it almost, it almost hits directly against the dough. That's going to speed up the process of baking the loaf, baking the bread. And this is already very, very similar to Maaser Tanur, to a baking, where the heat is coming from the outside, more or less. And maybe is it possible that Rish Lakish would admit that in this case, Rav Yochanan, who argued with him, is right, and this is called already a Maaser Tanur, Afiyah B'Tanur. Amalei, again, Rav Zera balks at it. My Amalei, how can I ask this question? The Iaminole, if I ask him, Amalei is going to certainly respond to me, Rov Aniyim Osim Ken. The poor people, in order to speed up the process of baking, and they don't want to use too many logs, which are relatively expensive for the poor people, so they don't want to keep the fire going from the bottom, from the outside. What they do is they heat up the dough by holding on to this source of heat, this ash that's in the avuka, in the torch. And in any event, that is a classic case of Maaser Ilfus. That's what Rish Lakish was talking about when he spoke about Maaser Ilfus. So I have a note here. He says that the Suffolker of Yosef, who wanted to ask this question, was in a case of an oven that was not heated up, but rather you put a dough inside the oven and then you hold the torch inside the oven. And that was the question that Rav Yosef really wanted to ask, whether or not that's considered Afiyah B'Tanur. Because Afiyah B'Tanur means that the heat comes from the outside, the entire oven on the inside is heated up, and then you put the dough in. Here, what you're doing is you're putting it inside the oven, but you're heating the oven, or I should say more precisely, you're heating the dough with this avuka, with this torch. Is that called afiyah? Ve'shiva Rab Zera Shavadei Maaser Tanur. This is the Ramban, exactly the opposite of Rashi, that the final answer, which Rabbi Zera responded to Rav Yosef, is that on the contrary, this is the way poor people bake their bread. They can't afford all the logs underneath the oven. So what they do is they put the dough in the oven, and then they're able to apply a torch to the dough. So as Rashi is learning that Rov Aniyim Osim Ken, and therefore that's exactly the Maaser Ilfus about which Rav Rish Lakish said there's no Chiyuv Challah. And the Ramban is saying just the opposite, that this is Rov Aniyim Osim Ken. This is exactly how they bake a bread in the oven, and therefore Yechayev and Chal. Now, that piece of Gemara that we did really belongs to the previous sugya. Right now, we're at the brink of starting a brand new sugya, and this is the famous sugya of Maaser Shayney. The question is whether Maaser Shayney is chayev in Challah, and this is going to be relevant to three different areas. What is the status of Maaser Shayney as far as Challah is concerned? Number two, as far as Matzah is concerned. Number three, as far as an esrog of Maaser Shayney is concerned. Now, just to review the basics, Maaser Shayney is the second tenth that you separate on years 1, 2, 4, and 5. It has to be eaten b'tahara. In other words, it has kedushas Maaser Shayney. It has to be eaten in Yerushalayim. And there's a gigantic sugya, Masechta Kedusha Daf Nun Daled, as to whether or not it's considered mammon bailu. Do you have ownership over Maaser Shayney? Because it's a very limited kind of ownership. I'm only allowed to take it to Yerushalayim and eat it, b'kedusha in Yerushalayim. And in that sense, it belongs, it's called mammon gavoa. And the sugya there deals with the issue of whether you can be makadosh and isha with Maaser Shayney. Omer of Asi, Isa shal Maaser Shayney l'divrei Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir in Masechta Kedusha maintains that Maaser Shayney is mammon gavoa. It doesn't belong to you. and therefore P'tur min Challah. And the Gemara is going to explain why ownership is a precondition for the Chiyuv Challah. Because the Torah says, Reishis Ariso Seichem. It has to be yours, and Maaser Shayney is not yours. However, says Rav Asi, L'divrei Chachamim, who in Kedushin say that you could be Mekadosh and Isha with Maaser Shayney, and therefore it is Mom and BIyun, is Chayeves B'Challah. All right, here we look on Daf Lamed Ches. Matzah shel Maaser Shayney, and again, keep in mind that matzah is subject to what we call Mitzvah of Matzah. If, let's say, outside of Yerushalayim, you would eat a matzah that was baked from Maaser Shayney, then for sure you don't say the Mitzvah of Matzah. But here we're talking about Maaser Shayney that was brought to Yerushalayim. And l'chora, when it comes to matzah, everybody should agree that you yotzei your chiyuv matzah in Yerushalayim with Maaser Shayney. It's heter. There's no aver involved. And even if you'll argue like Rabbi Meir that it's mom and gavah, what difference does it make? Nowhere does the Torah say that I have to own the matzah. And yet the Gemara says the Gemara is going to have to explain what is the source for the requirement of bailus, of ownership, in the case of matzah. L'divrei Chachamim, who hold that Maaser Shayney is mom and BIyun, he could be Mekadosh and Isha, Yechayev and Challah, Yotzei Bo Yedei Chavasa b'Pesach Yubi Yotzei Matzah. Now we get to Esrog. Now, in the case of Esrog, clearly you have to have ownership over the Esrog. The Torah says, L'kachtem lachem, and therefore, Esrog shel Maaser Shayney, Divrei Rabbi Meir, who holds mom and gavah, is Ein Adam Yotzei Bo Yedei Chavasa b'Yontif. On Sukkot, he cannot fulfill his mitzvah with an Esrog of Maaser Shayney. However, l'divrei Chachamim, it's mom and BIyun, Adam Yotzei Yedei Chavasa b'Yontif. Now, it's interesting that the Gemara uses the language Yontov. After all, we're talking about Sukkot here. What's the choice of the phrase Yontif? So the commentaries here, starting with the Rashash and others, say that Yontif here means as opposed to Chol HaMoed. Because with regard to Chol HaMoed, where we take the Daled Minim as an extension of what they did in Beis HaMikdash, where it says V'smachtem l'fnei Hashem l'keichem shivas yomim in the Beis HaMikdash, where the chiyuv of the Daled Minim is Doraisa all 7 days of the Chag, and that's derived from Usmachtem. There's no requirement of ownership, and therefore the pasuk L'kachtem lachem, which refers to the first day of Pesach in Gvulin, and requires bailus, that doesn't apply during Chol HaMoed. And therefore, he goes out of his way to emphasize the Yontif, that we're talking about the first, or in Chutzah, it's the first 2 days of Pesach. So that's where Ravasi wants to tell me that on the days, the balance of Sukkos, you have no Chol HaMoed Sukkos, you have no problem with an esrog at all. The chiddush is that even on Yontif, where the Torah requires lachem, you have no problem with a Maaser Shayney dika esrog according to the Chachamim, because they hold mom and BIyun. Now, the strange thing here is that this sugya is completely cut off from the original sugya of matzah of Maaser Shayney back on Daf Lamed Vav, which we studied just today. And in that sugya, the Gemara derives from the pasuk B'chol Moshvo Seichem that you can only use matzah for the mitzvah of matzah if that matzah can be eaten anywhere on the face of the globe, to the exclusion of Maaser Shayney, which can only be eaten in Yerushalayim. So it's very strange that the Gemara is completely oblivious to this. In fact, there's another drasha that the Gemara offered back on Lamed Vav to exclude matzah of Maaser Shayney under the law of lechem oni, because the Torah says in Parshas Kisavo that Maaser Shayney cannot be eaten by ninus, by an onen who never buried his dead, and matzah is called lechem oni, which means, if you read it with an aleph anyway, it's the lechem of aninus.
Right.
And Maaser Shayney is anything but aninus. Maaser Shayney is antithetical to aninus. Lo achalti mani mimenu. And here the Gemara is just taking it from a whole different perspective. Is Maaser Shayney considered yours? Do you own it? And hence you could use it for matzah, or do you not own it? The Gemara is just somehow oblivious to the whole previous sugya. And that's what Rashi points out here on the top of the Omud, Vafilu lo dorish oni loshen aninus, meaning even if I can allow for something that is antithetical to aninus, and that would be included in matzah. I don't have the drasha that oni is to be read not with an ayin but with an aleph. Nevertheless, BIyun Maaser Shayney. And the Gemara is going to try to derive this from psukim that you need ownership over the matzah. So that Rashi is really referring here, although he doesn't mention Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva was the one who rejected this drasha. He used the word ani to exclude matzah shani locha b'mei peros. That's not considered lechem oni. He doesn't have the drasha of the exclusion of Maaser Shayney. All right. Naskif Flora Papa Bishlema Isa. As far as the Chiyuv Chal is concerned, I understand that it depends on this machlokas stream Rabbi Meir and the Chacham Dichsiv. The Torah says Reishis Ariso Seichem Chala Tarimu Truma. And Ariso Seichem means Mishelachem, it's got to be yours. And according to Rabbi Meir, Maaser Shayney is Mama Gavoa, it's not yours, and therefore you're parted from Chala. Esrog, I understand, if it's a Maaser Shayney, the Esrog Nami, the Civil Katem Lachem. Lachem Mishelachem Yehei. You have to own your daled minim. That's why the Gemara establishes that if you steal a daled minim, you're not yotze unless it was after Shini Rishus, and also in the case of a katan, if he acquires ownership through what's called dasacheres makna, he can't give it back to you, and therefore you're in big trouble if you give your daled minim to a katan. And all this applies on the first day of Yontif, where the Torah requires lachem. So once again, according to Rabbi Meir, it makes sense to exclude matzah, to exclude an esrog of Maaser Shayney because it's mama gavah, it's not lachem. Ella matzah miksiv matzaschem. Does it say anywhere in the Bible that you have to own the matzah? Omar Rava v'tema Rabbi Yemer bar Shloimi. Halacha is that matzah needs to be yours. Why? Because of Gzeira Shava, Asil Lechem, which compares matzah to Challah, Ksiv Hacha. Here it says in matzah, Lechem Oni, Ksiv Hasam, there with regard to Challah. V'haya b'cholchem, Lechem ha'aretz. Is Malahal Mishalachem, Afkan Mishalachem. I never really understood this Gemara, because Gzeira Shava doesn't mean that we equate it completely, 100%. We equate it within some logical, reasonable framework. And to say carte blanche that because you have Gzeira Shava, all the same dinim apply. Like, for example, we have a famous Gzeira Shava of Havaya, which means that there's an equation between Gerushin and Kedushin. And you might say that just like in the case of Kedushin, you need Lishma, and therefore, in the case of Gittin, you need Lishma. Kosav La Sefer Krisis, so too, in the case of Kedushin, you need Lishma. But we're not going to take that to an extreme. We're not going to say that all the halachas that apply to a get, ipso facto, apply to Kedushin. Like, for example, Kedushin, you have something called Kedushay Bia. So are we're gonna suggest that you could also have Gerushin through Bia? I mean, there are obvious limitations to Xeris Shava. I mean, the Torah says that Yochayv and Challah, not because he owns the Challah, but because you own the Challah. But in Matzah, if there's no source that's explicit requiring ownership, but the Gemara assumes that the Xeris Shava is enough. In fact, if you ask me what is the essence of the Xeris Shava, I would say it's a definition of Lechem. Whatever you define as Lechem in Challah, ipso facto is Lechem as far as Matzah is concerned. So if you want to derive conclusions about like the whole Gemara about Sufkanin and Rekikin and different kinds of shaped, thin, or fat matzahs, or whether or not you could be Yotzi Matzah, you might want to stretch your arm out to Challah, because lechem. But something extraneous to the definition of lechem, like ownership, I mean that's not part of the definition of lechem. The Torah adds in the case of Challah that you're not Challah. I don't have to run around. As soon as I see a Challah, I got to be mafresh Challah. It's my lechem. I owe it to the Kohen to separate Challah. But matzah, I mean, you want to invite me to your house to eat matzah? I promise I'll wear a mask. Then it's okay, I can eat your matzah. You can eat my matzah. So the Gemara says, "Lema misayel." The Gemara wants to quote a brisa to support the assumption of Rav Asi, and it's not clear exactly why this brisa is support for Rav Asi. The brisa says, "Isa shal Maaser Shayney p'tur min hachala divrei Rabbi Meir v'chacham omrim chayeves." All right, so we know that there's a machlok between Rabbi Meir and Chacham about Maaser Shayney, where there's moment gavoa, moment bailim, and the nafkamina here is challah. Yeah, but that doesn't really cut the mustard over here. We want to know about other implications, like for example, esrog or matzah. It's one thing to say that he's potem in a challah in the case of Maaser Shayney, but it's another thing to say that he can't use Maaser Shayney for the Mitzvah of Matzah. So the Gemara asks the following question: Lema misayea, if this anonymous Amora is trying to prove Rav Asi's understanding of Challah, then what's Lema Misayel? I mean, it's pretty explicit. Hainu Hak, Hachi Kamar. This is what the anonymous Amora wanted to say. He had a suffix. There was still an inch of a suffix here as to whether or not this brisa supports Rav Asi, even vis-a-vis the question of Maaser Shayney and Challah. Why? Lema mida pligi beisa is bahanach nami pligi. Now we assume that if, with regard to the definition of Isa of Maaser Shayney, there's going to be a machlokes that's codified here in this brisa between Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim about whether or not Maaser Shayney qualifies as Ariso Sechem, it's yours. But does that necessarily prove that they argue even in the cases of esrog and matzah? And therefore, if we assume the answer is yes, that there's going to be a three-part machlokas with three nafkaminas, then lema misayela. But on the other hand, it's possible dilma hasam t'ksiv ariso sechem trei zimni. Maybe the Torah went out of its way to write the word ariso sechem not once but twice. We'll read the pasuk in just a minute, but because it's an extra pasuk ariso sechem, therefore the Torah requires mamon gomor. It has to be totally your isa, your dough. Right? Pop has dough, right? So it's not enough to say that you're allowed to eat it. You have to own it. And therefore, according to Rabbi Meir in Maaser Shayney, it's not yours, and therefore you're not chayiv v'chal. But in the case of esrog, it doesn't say the word lachem twice, it only says it once. And maybe you have a partial ownership would be sufficient. And it means that as long as you didn't steal it or you didn't borrow it, you're allowed to eat it. And that's what you invited to do. Maybe that's enough bailus. And in that case, you could be yotze, even according to Rabbi Meir, with an esrog or matzah, that's Maaser Shayney. Now, where does it say Arisol Sechem twice in Challah? The Pasuk in Shlach says, Reishis Arisol Sechem Challah Tarimo Truma Kitrumas Goren Kain Tarimo Sami Reishis Arisol Sechem Titnu Lashem Truma Lidoro Sechem. So from the extra word Arisol Sechem, which could have been easily omitted, the Torah is raising the demands and the conditions for a chiyuv challah on a higher level. It's got to be moment gamur, and it's not enough that, let's say, I'm allowed to eat this because I'm not stealing it or I didn't borrow it from you. That would be enough. And therefore, the Torah adds an extra risol sechem to exclude those cases where you have let's call it a miktas bailus, and therefore it's quite possible that even in the light of this brisa, even Rabbi Meir would be machshir and esrog shel Maaser Shayney or matzah shel Maaser Shayney. Now, in the footnote here, he quotes the Rosh. In Siman Yud Ches, the Rosh writes that you cannot be yotze the mitzvah of matzah with matzah gzula, and the reason for that, says the Rosh, is because einot shalachem, it's not yours. And the Rosh bases himself on the Gzeira Shava between Challah and Matzah. And just like in Challah we require ownership, so too in Matzah we require ownership. But then he quotes the Yerushalmi, and the Yerushalmi at the beginning of Challah says, "B'di'eved you could be yotze with a stolen matzah." And the Rosh says it might be a machlokas amoraim in the Yerushalmi, but according to one shita, you're not yotze with challah, matzah gzula for a different reason, because of mitzvah ba'avera, but not because it's not yours. So in terms of challah, you would not be chayiv in challah because you don't own the isa; you stole it. In matzah, even though you stole the matzah, if not for the principle of mitzvah ba'aver, you would be yotze. And we're not going to apply, according to that man Omar, the gzeira shava, the equation between challah and matzah. And the Magid Mishnah in the 6th parak of Chometz Matzah has a gewaldige chidush against the Rosh. He wants to claim that even according to the Shalmi, you're not yotze with matzah if it's not yours. So therefore, the Magid Mishnah has to face the following question. So why does the Yerushalmi feel compelled to introduce another variable, another principle, in order to disqualify matzah gzula and say it comes under mitzvah ba'avera? Forget about mitzvah ba'avera. If he stole it and it's not his, then we see clearly that he cannot be yotze the mitzvah of matzah. So the Magid Mishnah answers that Yerushalmi is talking about a case where he stole wheat. He stole stalks of wheat. And then he converted it into a flour, and then he baked it. And that's called shinui maaser, that even in the laws of Gzela, despite the fact that you stole these stalks of wheat, it still can become yours. Again, I don't know if there's any other legal system in the world other than halacha. Lahavdil, the halacha operates with sometimes revolutionary principles that you can actually own something that you steal, and that's if you kone b'shinu. So when he takes these chitim and he bakes them, they're stolen chitim, but then he converts them into a flour dough, etc., and he bakes it, and he was kone b'shinu. It's really his, and therefore, what the Yerushalmi has in mind is a case of matzah gzula that he was kone b'shinui, and yet he's not yotze because of mitzvah ba'aver. The Ritva in Masechta Sukkah, in the famous sugya of mitzvah ba'aver, he says that matzah gzula is considered yours, and the reason for that is because you chew up the matzah, and the very moment you chew up the matzah and you begin to swallow it, you're already you already kona the matzah, you're chayv in tashlum, and you have to pay its value, but the matzah is yours, and therefore the only possible way we can revoke your mitzvah and disqualify it is only if we assume that it is a mitzvah haba b'avera. And again, if he wasn't kona the gzela l'chora, even without mitzvah haba b'avera, there would be a chisarn of lachem based on this gzera shav from Challah. Boy Rav Shimon ben Lakish, Ma'u sheyetze odom yidei chovaso v'chalash al Maaser Shayney b'Yerushalayim. If you're in Yerushalayim, then clearly it's your Maaser Shayney. Or at least if you hold like the Chachamim that Maaser Shayney is moment BIyun, then for sure you should be chayav in Challah. And if you're chayav in Challah, then you should be able to be yotzi yidei chovaso b'matzah, because we have an equation, as we saw before, between lechem oni and lechem in v'hoya b'alcholchem lechem haaretz. So what is the suffix now of Reish Lakish? When you think about it, if you're going according to Chachamim, it's moment bailim, and you're chayiv in Challah in the case of Maaser Shayney, why, right? Because he's in Yerushalayim. So why would Reish Lakish entertain the possibility that he's not yotzei the mitzvah of matzah? He says the following. I'll leave it to Rabbi Yossi Aglili lo tiboilach. Hashta be'isas chulin lo nafik v'chalaso miboy. In other words, Rabbi Yossi Aglili, back on Daf Lamed Vav, had derived from the pasuk lechem oni, which means that it's a lechem that can be eaten ba'ninus, and only such a lechem qualifies for matzah, to the exclusion of Maaser Shayney that cannot be eaten by ninus, then lo tiboilcha, for sure he's not yotze, because even if the isa was chulin, and let's say it was after he was mafresh challah, the balance of the isa, which is called shiarei ha'isa, is chulin, he cannot be yotze with that chulin, because that's not a matzah necheles be'aninus. Now, I'm not sure exactly what the Gemara means here when it speaks about shiarei isa shel Maaser Shayney. So in other words, what happened? He took challah, and now he has Maaser Shayney, which he cannot eat by ninus. And that would be true even in the case of the shirayim, which is chulin, is in the challah part of Maaser Shayney. Boy, for sure he wouldn't be yotzi his chiyuv of matzah, because now we have an additional issue here. No, it's not only is it a problem of eino nechal ba'ninus, but it's also a problem of eino shavel chol nefesh. It's not everyone could eat this challah. Only a kohen is allowed to eat this challah. Kiti Boilach, my question, says Reish Lakish, is according to Rabbi Akiva, because Rabbi Akiva holds that you could be yotze with matzah shel Maaser Shayney. But what about the case of challah that was taken from Maaser Shayney? Now, why is challah a little bit different? The Torah says, "B'chol moshvosechem tochlu matzos," and the Chazal darshan back on Daf Lamed Vav that ein adam yotze yodei chova ela b'matzah reuya lechol b'chol hamoshavos. And nevertheless, Rabbi Akiva holds that you could be yotzi a chiyuv matzah with Maaser Shayney, even though you're not allowed to eat it outside of Yerushalayim, so it's not b'chol moshavos. And the reason for that is the Gemara had invoked the principle of Rabbi Eliezer that if the Maaser Shayney contracts tumah, then he could redeem the Maaser Shayney even in Yerushalayim and eat it outside Yerushalayim. So there's a possibility, theoretically, that Maaser Shayney could be eaten anywhere on the face of the globe, and therefore it fulfills the condition of B'chol Moshvos Seichem with regard to matzah. Now, what's the suffix? Bechulin who did nafak. It makes sense that if you have the shirayim of this dough of Maaser Shayney, after you take off challah, and it's chulin and it's mutter for everybody, then you can be able to the I mitamu, because if this Maaser Shayney contracts tumah, yeshlem heter b'chol moshavos. Aval challah the I mitama lesla heter b'chol moshavos u'l'sreifa ozla. So we have halacha truma shenitmeis that it's ton sreifa. So there's no actual heter b'chol moshavos, and therefore lo nafik. In this case, even Rabbi Akiva would agree that if you have challah of Maaser Shayney, so even though, as far as the Maaser Shayney element per se, if we could single that out, you would be yotzei matzah because it's royal l'chol moshavos if it contracts tumah. But since it's also challah, right? So the chulin part is not an issue, but the challah part, that's already a different issue. Because Leslie Heter, even if it would be Makabel Tumah, it becomes Truma Tmeya, which is Ton Sreifa. You're not allowed to eat Truma Tmeya. Now, the Gemara is going to say, oh, Dilma. And maybe there is a possibility of classifying the challah itself as Bechol Moshvos Seichem. And how is that? I mean, there's no heter to eat chalash and nitmes. So I'm wondering if maybe what the Gemara means here, we'll see the Gemara inside in a minute. I like to sort of, think out of the box a little bit. Maybe what the Gemara has in mind is that, okay, it's true that if it contracted tumah, then you would not be allowed to eat this challah, which is matzah. But nevertheless, if it's tahar and a kohen is allowed to eat it, that itself is enough to validate, to qualify this matzah. Let's see. Oh, Dilma, maybe even the challah of Maaser Shayney is valid for the mitzvah of matzah. And you'll ask me, but wait a second, Maaser Shayney can only be eaten in Yerushalayim, so it's not Bechol Moshvos Seichem. And what are you going to answer? Because it might contract tumah, and then it's subject to pidyon. But the problem is that the chal itself, if it became tameh, needs streifa. I mean, there's no pidyon. It's completely also. So you don't have b'chol moshvos seichem. Amrinon hol v'ilu lo kara l'shem bitamu islay het b'chol moshavos l'nafik ba hashtanami nafik. What would be in a case where the dough contracted tumah before he was mafresh challah? So then it's considered yesh la heter b'chol moshavos. Again, that would be only in a case where it contracted tumah before you were mafresh challah. Hashtanami here too, if he was mafresh challah when it was tahora, then it became tameh, he could still use it to fulfill his mitzvah of matzah. Why? He says, Kevan shemitzad shem challah levad ein lepotzlek shi tahora sharehi nicheles b'chol moshavos. Umitzad Shem Maaser Shayney levad gam kein ein leposlo mishum sheilu lo titame teilo het b'chol moshavos sheilu titame teilo het b'chol moshavos afkan itztarfu shnei hashemos b'matzah achas umachmaskeni efshali ochlo b'chol moshavos im titama. Is ein ze posla. In other words, you have here almost a coincidental overlap where you lock two doors. On the one hand, you're locking the door b'chol moshavos because of the Maaser Shayney element in this dough, in this challah. But we can open that door because if the dough would contract tumah, then you're allowed to be poded. You can eat it b'chol moshavos. But now we have another door that locks us in, and that is because it's challah. And challah shenitmes cannot be eaten. So the Gemara now is suggesting that we separate between these two shemos. In other words, as far as the shem Maaser Shayney is concerned, it could theoretically potentially be eaten in the case where it contracted tumah.
Right.
As far as challah is concerned, well, challah tahora can certainly be eaten. Now it contracted tumah and it cannot be eaten, but that doesn't impinge on the shem Maaser Shayney. So the shem challah itself would not exclude the matzah and invalidate it because the shem challah, I meant to say, because challah can be eaten b'tara by the kohen. And the shem Maaser Shayney itself, if I isolated it, would not undermine the status of this matzah because if it was tameh, you could eat it after pidyon anywhere in the world. It happens to be coincidentally that we now have a dough that at the same time is Maaser Shayney and it's challah. And the fact that it's challah locks the door on, well, as far as Maaser Shayney, it's b'chol moshavosechem because if it contracts tumah, well, if it contracts tumah, it's also challah, and you can't eat challah tmeah. But that's just a coincidental overlap. That what you happen to have here is both Maaser Shayney and challah. Ika diamri, we have another lishna that presents this suffix in a different light. There's definitely a clear-cut decision here, a ruling that you could be yotzei a chiyuv matzah with challah of Maaser Shayney b'Yerushalayim. Devadi, I'm reading Hoil. We're going to apply the logic of the second side that the Gemara presented before called Hoil. And we can look at theoretical possibilities. In other words, this particular matzah, theoretically, under the law of Maaser Shayney, if it would contract tumah, could be eaten anywhere in the world.
Right.
That's hoil. Although it happens to be challah, and then if it contracted tumah, it cannot be eaten anywhere in the world. But rather, what was the suffix that we vacillated about? That was challah halakuach bekesef shel Maaser Shayney. You were mafresh challah mina isa, and everything was chulin. And now what you did was you sold this challah to a kohen. And the kohen, what kind of money did he have to pay you for this challah? He had what we call kesef of Maaser Shayney, which means that, let's say I was poda my Maaser Shayney onto kesef, and now I gave this kesef over to the kohen. And that kesef has the status of kesef Maaser Shayney in Yerushalayim. And now the kohen uses that kesef to purchase challah. Again, challah of chulin. And now we say what's called tfisas domin, and the kedusha of Maaser Shayney will now apply, or shall we say, extend to the challah. Now, for this, you really have to know a lot. Here, he says in the footnote, Kesef shechilo alav Maaser Shayney, v'nitfeses ba kedusha smaser u'maylam osav Yushalayim. So he transferred the kedusha of Maaser Shayney over to these, over to the kesef. Now he takes the kesef up to Yerushalayim. Shom konim lo divrei machal. V'al yidei kach mischaleles kedushaso. V'nitpeses aleim. I don't know. He's not too clear about the word aleim here. I hate when they use these ambiguous terms, these pronouns. Let me give a shot at it. I think he means aleim means on the kesef Maaser Shayney. So the kedushas Maaser Shayney now is. Second, I'm sorry. No. What am I saying? Not the kesef itself. The kesef itself has kedushas Maaser Shayney, but he uses that kesef to buy food stuff. And now the food stuff is endowed with kedushas Maaser Shayney.
Right.
So what's the tzad to say that he could be yotze? Right. So now we're talking about an isas chulin that was purchased with kesef Maaser Shayney, and now it's endowed with kedushas Maaser Shayney. And what? I mean, again, if it contracts tumah, then it can be poded. So it's considered b'chol moshvos seichen. Oh, I'll leave it the Rabbanan Loti Boilecha. There's no suffix according to the Chachamim. Kaven the Amri, they hold that even Ochel Tameh, if it was purchased from Kesef Maaser Shayney, Ipodeh, you're allowed to be poded. It's therefore Hainu Maaser. So this challah that was purchased with Kesef Maaser Shayney has the same identical din and status as the Maaser Shayney itself, and there's a heter of B'chol Moshe Seichem Yin Tama. So therefore, he can certainly be yotze his chiyuv of matzah with this chalas chulin that was purchased with Kesef Maaser Shayney and has the kedusha Maaser Shayney. And the chal is considered yesh lo heter b'chol mos Shabbos. Now, the only problem is that we're talking about challah. And insofar as it's challah, if it becomes tameh, it cannot be eaten. But we're going to say hoil, like we said before, because the Ikad Amri holds loti boilecha devade amrinan hoil. And we could say that if it wouldn't have been challah, if it was just Maaser Shayney, then if it contracted tumah, he would be allowed to eat it in Yerushalayim because he could be poder the Maaser Shayney. Kiti boilecha. What's the suffix? I'll leave it to Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda has a different shita about ochel, about food stuff that was bought with Kesef Maaser Shayney, and then it contracted tumah, and he holds yikaver. In other words, not like the Chacham who say that you can be poder the ochel that was bought with Kesef Maaser Shayney if it contracted tumah, but rather if it contracts tumah, says Rabbi Yehuda, you have to bury it. In other words, there's no possibility of pigeon. So now we have the suffix. What's the din of this challah according to Rabbi Yehuda, who holds that there would be no possibility of pigeon? Now again, I still don't understand the suffix. The Gemara is going to have to clarify that because once again, I should apply the principle of hoil. The only reason there's no pidyon here is because it happens to be challah shenitmes. But that's already a separate independent problem. As far as the Maaser Shayney issue is concerned, you would be able to be podeh it if it contracted tumah. So first, the Gemara goes on a little bit of a digression here. What is the machlokus between Rabbi Yehuda and Chachamim regarding food that was purchased with Kesef Maaser Shayney, and then it became Tomei? So the Mishnah is in the third parak of Maaser Shayney. It says, Halakuach b'Kesef Maaser Shayney. He had Kesef Maaser Shayney and he buys food with that Kesef, Shenitma, and if that food contracts Tumah, the Chachamim say Yipodah. He can transfer the Kedusha onto food. The Kedusha from the Maaser went on to the Kesef, and now when he buys food with that Kesef, and that food has Kedushas Maaser Shayney, if it contracts Tumah, is Yipodah. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Yikaver. Rabbi Yehuda says that since this machal was purchased with Kesef Maaser Shayney, it doesn't have the same kedusha of kedushas Maaser Shayney atzmo. It doesn't have the atzmo shel kedusha, and therefore, ein bo koach lehatfis kedusha b'davar ach. It cannot pass on kedusha to anything else, and therefore, if it becomes tamei, is ein lo pidyon. It needs kvura. That's the shita of Rabbi Yehuda. So now the Gemara explains the suffix according to Rabbi Yehuda. Mi amrin, shall we say hoil v'ilo lakuach havi? If this wasn't a problem of Kesef Maaser Shayney, that this food was bought with Maaser Shayney, if it would have been Maaser Shayney itself and it became tamei, it has pidyon. And if it has pidyon, it's mutalocho b'chol moshavos, and therefore it should be valid for the mitzvah of matzah. Let's apply that to lakuach b'Maaser Shayney, because lakuach b'Maaser Shayney should not have a stricter law than the Maaser Shayney itself. And he writes here, hatam shelakuach eino nifter. Why is it that you cannot be podeh that food which you purchased with Maaser Shayney geld and it contracted tumah? Eino machmas kumra, so it's not a chumra. Ela adarabah, machmas kula sheyesh bo, which means the kedusha is not a kedusha chamura. It's already a nat bar nat. It's a second, how do we say, a second generation of Maaser Shayney, and that's why Eini Yechola Lios Nitfeses b'Maichel Haniftabo, so that even if we're talking about challah, and even if it was Maaser Shayney atzmo, which wouldn't have a heter bechol moshavos if it became tamei because it's challah, but kevan shaliachet shenitmes asur b'achila mikol makol reisha yeches kan svaras hoil the ilu lo shame. If he hadn't called the shame challah on this Maaser Shayney, the itma, and it would contract tumah yesh lo heter b'moshavos. In such a case, you would be allowed to eat it anywhere. V'nafik bay, and he therefore should certainly be able to be yotze the Mitzvah of Matzah. Hashtanami nafik bay. Even now, if he was korashem challah, and it was lakuach b'keser Maaser Shayney, nevertheless yotze by yedei chavasa. O dilma, shall we say, chad hoel amrinon, trei hoel lo amrinon. We're not going to double up hoel in the same food and consider it royal achilu b'chol moshavos. And here in our case, in our scenario, you're going to have to add, you're going to have to pile up, piggyback 2 svaras of hoel, and that we're not going to say. So we're going to assume that this foodstuff is not royal achila b'chol moshavos, because in all cases when we apply this sort of hoil to make the matzah re'uyel achila b'chol moshavos, that's chalas Maaser Shayney atzma. And hoil, since if he wouldn't have been koresh shem challah, it would have a heter moshavos. And another case would be matzas chulin shenilkacha b'kesef Maaser Shayney. And then we apply the principle of hoil. If this Michael was not bought with Kesef Maaser Shayney, but rather with Maaser Shayney Atzmo, it could be considered Nechal B'chol Moshavos. And therefore you could be Yotzi Dechova. But to say two hoils, one on top of the other, that we're not going to say. Amar Rava Mistavra Sheshem Maaser Chadhu. That there's one din that applies uniformly to Maaser Shayney itself and to a Michael Shenikne B'Kesef Maaser Shayney. We should not make a distinction between them. And since you could be Yotze Yechdei Chiyuv Matzah with Chalas Maaser Shayney because of this sort of Hoil, so you could be Yotze Yochiyuv of Matzah with Challah that was bought with Kesef Maaser Shayney, because it's all coming Mikoch Maaser. And we can't be machmir from the original source and excluded from the mitzvah of matzah. Let's just review the suffix of the Gemara according to Lishna Basra. And the problem we said was one hoil or two hoils. And the Gemara in the Lishna Basra introduces the Shita Rabbi Yehuda, as codified by the Mishnah in Masechta Maaser Shayney in the third parak, that records machlokas between the Chacham and Rabbi Yehuda about lakuach b'kesef Maaser Shayney shenitma, whether or not it lends itself to pidyon. It's very interesting that what's counterintuitive here about Rabbi Yehuda's Shita when he says that there's no pidyon in foodstuff that was lakuach b'kesef Maaser Shayney that contracted tumah. It's because Lakuach B'Kesef Maaser Shayney does not have the same status exactly, the same Kedusha as Maaser Shayney. There's no pidyon because the Kedusha level is lower. When you have an intense Kedusha, that lends itself to what we call Hatfasa, that you can take that Kedusha and pass it on to something else that can replace it, and the most take on the Kedusha. But when you have this F-baked Kedusha of Davar Lakuach B'Kesef Maaser Shayney, it doesn't have the same identical Kedusha level as Maaser Shayney, it doesn't lend itself to pidyon. But now, if according to Rabbi Yehuda, we want to be machshir this matzah under the law b'chol moshvos seichem, we're going to have to apply a double hoil. What are the two hoils? First of all, hol ilo lakuach havi. If this machal which he purchased with Kesef Maaser Shayney was not bought by Kesef Maaser Shayney, but it was Maaser Shayney itself, then it would lend itself to pidyon. The fact that it's lakuach b'Maaser Shayney and doesn't lend itself to pidyon is only a reflection of its kula status, that it doesn't have the same level of kedusha. So it would be very odd to say that had it been Maaser Shayney itself, then we would say it's considered b'chol moshvos seichem, because if it contracted tumah, it lends itself to pidyon. But now that it's only lakuach b'kesef Maaser Shayney, if it becomes tamei and it doesn't lend itself to pidyon, that's a result of the fact that adarabah kesef lakuach b'kesef Maaser Shayney is on a lower madreg of kedusha, and therefore there's no possibility of being matfis, of being oded. But here we're going to apply the principle of hoil had it not been lakuach, but had it been Maaser Shayney itself. But that's not enough, because even in Maaser Shayney per se, since it contracts tumah, then we have to worry about the fact that it's also challah, so that even if you could be poded, but since it contracted tumah, it doesn't lend itself to achila. There's no head to achila. And here we're going to say another din of hoil. And we're going to say hov lo korale shem. Had it not been challah, if we could have just isolated that one dimension, that one variable, the element of Maaser Shayney, then it would have lent itself to Kol Mosh Vosechem through Pidyon. It happens to be at to boot on top, it's also Challah because he was Korachem Challah, and Challah Shenitmes cannot lend itself to Pidyon with any Achil, therefore it's not B'chol Mosh Vosechem. So there we're going to apply the principle of Hoil. Had he not been Korah Shem and you just isolate purely Maaser Shayney, then it would have been Nitan Lechol B'chol Mosh Vosechem if it became Tomei and you could be poded and they'd eat it anywhere in the world. But to combine and piggyback one hoil on top of the other, that we're not going to say. That's where the Gemara is vacillating. And Rava says, Shem Maaser Chadhu. Once the din in Maaser Shayney is such that you can consider it as matzah kshera because b'chol mosh vosechem in event that it became tummy and you can be voted. Therefore, kesef hanilkach mi kesef Maaser Shayney will have the same status as Maaser Shayney with regard to this kula that is kosher, it's mukshar for matzah, and it's considered b'chol mosh vosechem, even though, again, we're going to have to add another hoil if it would have been Maaser Shayney, and then a hoil if it wouldn't have been challah, but nevertheless, Rava says, kula chad Hashem Maaser Shayney ava, and we're not going to differentiate between the real McCoy original Maaser Shayney and its clone, meaning Kesef HaNilkach Maaser Shayney. And in both cases, we're going to say that he's Yotzi Deichovis Matzah if it was Chalas, not Maaser Shayney, but in this case, Chalas Machal HaNilkach B'Kesef Maaser. And that, my friends, is the end of this sugya. And we're going to stop here and make a note that we're up to Chalas Toda and Rikike Nos. So thank you so much.